All right. So as we saw last time, we're in the state of nature. We're rational. We're free. There's a moral law. We have natural rights. It's not a bad place. It's kind of benign. So the question is, why would we, according to Locke, voluntarily agree to leave the state of nature and to form a government and to live under civil society? And here's his argument. All right, so pretend that I'm Locke and you are my fellow members of the state of nature, and I'm speaking to you. I'm gonna argue to you that we'd be better off if we leave the state of nature and live under government. And here's why. Okay, now we have our natural rights to life, liberty, and property. But I mean, Locke is not living he's not living in a fairyland. He knows perfectly well that some people are going to cross moral boundaries and violate other people's rights, even in the state of nature. And there's three problems in the state of nature that make our natural rights less secure than they could be made. The first problem, he calls them an inconvenience, right? He says three inconveniences in the state of nature lead us to form government. The first inconvenience is this. Okay, we've seen that the state of nature has a moral law to govern it, the law of nature. But the law of nature and the natural law tradition more generally, is a system of deductive reasoning. We know the general principle. We're not to harm each other in our life, liberty, health, or property. But that's a very general statement. What we need to do in actual concrete life is know what to do in particular situations. So we always have to deduce from the general law of nature what the correct moral behavior is in any particular instance. The problem is that people who are equally intelligent, equally morally serious, can disagree over precisely what the moral law requires in any particular instance. I always like to use the example of the death penalty. I think people can disagree over the morality of the death penalty. Good people, serious people, intellectually and morally serious people can disagree. So there are some gray areas. It's not always crystal clear what the right thing to do is. But a law, in order for it to be effective in human society, has to be known and certain. We have to know if you do A, B is going to happen. So we need to have a greater certainty of the law in particular circumstances. So here's Locke's suggestion. Wouldn't we be better off if we agreed to elect a few people from among ourselves, our representatives, so to speak, and set them up in a little body and assign them the task of deducing a written legal code from the law of nature? They have to take the general principles of the law of nature and from that deduce a written legal code that's going to be binding on us in everyday life. So we know if we do A, B is going to happen. We have the certainty of a known and written law. And this little group that we're creating, whose task it is to declare the law, write it down, that gives rise, Locke says, to the first branch of government, which is, all right, you've guessed it, that gives rise to the legislative branch, to the legislature, whose job it is to declare and write down the law. All right, so that solves the first inconvenience. The second inconvenience or problem in the state of nature that makes our natural rights less secure than they could be is the problem of human partiality. It's been known since the beginning of time that no person can be a judge in their own case. If we're in conflict with someone else, the reason we're in conflict is because we think we're right and they think they're right. We can't both be right, but we think we are. We cannot objectively judge our own case or those of people that we love. But conflict is going to arise in the state of nature like anywhere else on earth. It's not heaven. So let's say there's two people. There's me and there's my next door neighbor. And between our houses runs a stream. Now let's say in good conscience and good faith, I truly, truly believe that that stream belongs to my family and my property. I really believe that. However, my neighbor, in equally good conscience and good faith, believes that the stream belongs to his property. Well, we can't both be right, but we both believe we are right. So how do we resolve this conflict? Well, Locke suggests the following. Wouldn't we be better off, with respect to conflict resolution and the protection of our rights, if we assign somebody to be an independent, impartial judge in the cases of conflict. And that person has no dog in the race, is disinterested, objective, will look at the facts, look at the law, and determine which party has justice on their side. That gives rise to the second branch of government, obviously, the judiciary. So Locke thinks he's explained now the remedy for the inconvenience of partiality is the creation of an impartial judiciary, just like the remedy for the lack of a written law is fulfilled by the legislature. All right, so the third and final inconvenience that suggests that we could be better off if we leave the state of nature is the following. Okay, we've seen, according to Locke, we have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. Our natural right to life, which means my right to exist, Locke says, generates a corollary natural right. We all also possess a natural right of self-defense. My right to life means nothing if I don't also have the right to defend my life against unjust aggression. So Locke says we each possess a natural right of self-defense. But the problem that arises, or the inconvenience that arises in the state of nature, is who's going to enforce our natural rights? There's no government, so if somebody tries to kill me, what do I have, or steal from me, or whatever, what do I have to do? I have to utilize my own natural right of self-defense and defend myself against unjust aggression. And I'm morally entitled to do that, Locke says, because I possess the natural right of self-defense. Okay, fine, so we each have to enforce the law. There is no governmental agency to do it, there's only us. That leads to certain problems. Let's say I'm out walking in the woods in the state of nature, and suddenly somebody jumps out from behind a grove of trees and runs at me with the clear intention to kill me. Locke says I am entitled, because of my right of self-defense and my right to life, to defend myself against this, even to the point of killing the other person if that's necessary to preserve my innocent life. Okay, so I'm morally entitled to do that, but the problem is I may not be physically able to do that. Maybe this person is 20 times stronger than I am and overwhelms me and kills me, even though I had the right to kill him. It's a problem many people are going to face. All of those who are not the physically strongest are still at the mercy of those who are physically stronger. So he says, what's the remedy for this? He argues as follows. The remedy is this. All right, I have a right of self-defense. Because I possess that right, I can delegate it to somebody else who's willing to exercise it on my behalf. For example, maybe I have a son. You know, he's in his 20s, he's young and he's strong, and I say, Jason, can I delegate my right of self-defense to you? Meaning, if somebody tries to attack me, attack my rights, would you be willing to jump in and defend me, to protect my rights against that person, to exercise my right of self-defense for me? If he accepts, now he has to accept, I can't impose it on him, but if he accepts, he says, sure, mother, I'll be happy to do that. Locke says that's perfectly legitimate. All I've done here is delegate the exercise of my right of self-defense to my son, who, when he comes to defend me, is entitled to do so because he is merely exercising my right of self-defense for me. Locke says this is perfectly legitimate. So here's the solution society-wide. Because so many of us are going to be in the position of maybe not being able to defend our natural rights ourselves, it's in our interest, all of us, to delegate our right of self-defense to another party. And let's say we pool up all of our rights of self-defense. We come over, we drop them in, and we agree to delegate it. Now, we're not giving it up. You always have a reserved right of self-defense, but we're delegating it. And what's formed is an entity that is constituted of all the natural rights of self-defense of all the members of the community. And in the future, if someone tries to violate my rights, I don't have to personally wrestle them to the ground. We can call upon the collective defense of the community who will come to our aid to defend us against unjust aggression. Think today, if someone's breaking into your home, you don't have to personally stop that violator, you call the police. And the community, the collective coercive force of the community, comes to help you to protect your rights, the rights of the innocent person, against a would-be predator. And the reason they're allowed to do that is because in our tradition we have authorized them. We have delegated our right of self-defense to this entity that we call the police. But more largely, the police are a member of which branch of government? This remedy by delegating our right of self-defense creates the third branch of government, obviously the executive branch, whose job is to execute or enforce the law. So Locke thinks he has explained the origin of government now. Government is the remedy for the three problems in the state of nature that make our rights less secure than they could be. The legislature remedies the lack of a written law, the judiciary remedies the lack of an impartial judge, and the executive remedies the lack of the sheer ability to enforce our rights. So you'll notice in all three cases, government has pretty much the same task. It is to administer the law that protects our rights by declaring the law, the legislature, adjudicating the law, the judiciary, and enforcing the law, the executive. So government has a clear purpose, and why do we delegate this authority to government? To make our natural rights more secure than they would be in the absence of government, in the state of nature. So now Locke thinks we have clearly defined the purpose of government. And the purpose of government is to make the natural rights of each and every individual more secure than they would be in the absence of government. It's a clear purpose. So, now what kind of obligation do we have? Well, let's examine more closely the implicit terms of the Lockean social contract. We agree to establish this three branches of government, and we also agree implicitly to obey the laws that they pass, because we are creating this government out of whole cloth. So we agree to obey the laws that the government passes to protect our rights. We also agree, because we're not crazy, that we will pay the necessary taxes to enable the government to perform the tasks that we have assigned to it. Who else is going to do it? There's nobody else in the state of nature. Policing and judging and legislating costs money. Who's going to pay for that? There's no one but us. So we know that. So we agree to pay the taxes that are necessary to enable the government to fulfill the task that we have assigned to it. Okay. The two parties to the social compact are we, the people, on the one side, and the government on the other. So the terms that apply to the government from this contractual arrangement are they acquire the right to expect us to obey the law and to pay the necessary taxes to support their activities. But they assume the obligation. What obligation does government have? Its obligation is to use the resources we give it to actually protect the natural rights of each and every individual. Now, as long as government is, those are the terms of the compact. We agree to obey the law, pay taxes. Government agrees to use the resources we give it to protect the natural rights of each individual. That's the Lockean social contract. Now, we have to admit, so what kind of obligation is generated? Is it absolute or conditional? Think about a contract in general. I have a contract with my apartment complex here in West Palm. Every year I sign a lease and I agree to pay a certain amount of money for a unit that's specified in the lease. The apartment management agrees to provide me with that unit for a certain amount of money. Are these absolute or conditional obligations generated by a rental contract? If you're here in front of me, I'm sure you all would recognize that these are conditional obligations. Does the apartment have to provide me with that apartment under any and all circumstances from the beginning of time to the end of the world? Is it an absolute obligation on their part? No, because what happens if I stop paying my rent? Well, if so, their obligation to provide me with the apartment is dissolved. They are no longer obliged to do that because I have broken my end of the contract. Or conversely, what if I pay my rent and I follow all the rules in the contract, but the apartment manager does not provide me with the unit that's described in my lease? Do I have to continue to pay the rent? Once again, no. I am absolved of my obligation because the other party has failed to live up to the terms of the contract. Every court in America adjudicates contract law this way. Contractual obligations generally, not always, but generally are conditional obligations. So let's look at the social contract between people and the government. Are we obliged to pay taxes and obey the law under any and all circumstances in the Lockean social contract? No, we're obliged to if government fulfills its end of the bargain, which is it protects our natural rights. But what if it doesn't? What if government fails to protect our rights, or worse yet, turns around and uses its power to actually violate the rights it's supposed to be protecting? This was the situation the Americans of the Revolutionary period found themselves in, they believed. Well, in that case, our obligation to obey the law and pay taxes is dissolved, just like the obligation to provide me with the apartment is dissolved if I don't pay my rent. If government fails to live up to its end of the contract, that breaks the contract, and our obligations are dissolved, and we are no longer bound and obliged to obey or support that government. And what happens is, not the end of the world, we just revert back to the state of nature, where at least we have our natural rights intact, and maybe we can design a better government that is better designed to secure our rights, as Thomas Jefferson will say in the Declaration. And this is the American idea. And you can understand how the American colonists in the 18th century saw in Locke a ready-made justification for their resistance to British rule. The colonists believed that the British had consistently violated their natural rights, and that therefore the British had broken its end of the compact because the king was supposed to protect the rights of his subjects, and he was not doing that. And so therefore they were dissolved of their obligations to England, and they declared themselves to be free and independent states. And they wrote the Declaration of Independence basically to explain to the world the moral justification for their actions. And in reading the Declaration of Independence, which we're going to do next very, very quickly, you're going to see that it is basically nothing but a summary of Locke's argument in the second treatise. There's nothing new in there. They were just restating the arguments that had saturated the American colonies for 40 years leading up to the American Revolution, where Locke's book, second treatise in particular, was found in 40% of American colonial homes, and the Americans were saturated with the Lockean philosophy. Thomas Jefferson even said, he says, I didn't write anything new in the Declaration of Independence. I was just restating the common sense of the era. It was common sense because everybody had been saturated in Locke's philosophy from the second treatise. Okay, so let's stop now, and then I'm going to come back next and just very quickly read parts of the Declaration to you, and you should immediately recognize that it's nothing but John Locke, stated in Jefferson's beautiful language. Okay, be right back.